Hello again, this is Ashen from Brothers Insanity, back with another Diablo 3 class breakdown. This time I'll be showing you through the first 13 levels of the Barbarian class. We have already completed a Wizard class breakdown, so if you haven't seen that video, I'd recommend you check it out. The Barbarian can be a bit more complex in deciding which weapons you choose. The Barbarian can use a one-hand with shield, two one-hand weapons, or one two-handed weapon. So far in the beta I was unable to dual wield two-hand weapons as in Diablo 2. Since most abilities go off weapon damage, it's smart to have a strong two-hand weapon to make the most of your skills. However, at the earlier levels, most one-hand weapons were nearly as strong as two-hand weapons, and thus I felt it was more beneficial to dual wield one-hand weapons rather than use a two-handed weapon. All a shield does is give you a little extra armor, but it's easily sacrificed for a second weapon to deal more damage, or be replaced with a two-hand weapon. Now I'll briefly explain how the skills work in case you don't already know. It's much different from Diablo 2 as there are no skill trees or skill points obtained to increase skills at each level. Instead, the player is given 6 slots which your skills will be assigned to. You also unlock runes for these abilities that change or buff the ability in some way. If you still don't get it, don't worry about it, you'll understand as the video goes on. The Barbarian starts off with a skill called Bash, assigned to the left mouse click. It's a straightforward attack dealing extra damage and having a chance of knocking back enemies. The ability also generates 6 Fury, which has taken the place of mana. Now, much like the Rage system in World of Warcraft, the Barbarian generates Fury with attacks, then uses it to unleash special abilities. Although you don't get an ability that actually uses Fury until level 2, Bash is still a much better option than the standard attack currently assigned to the right mouse click. The ability unlocked at level 2 is Hammer of the Ancients. This ability conjures an enormous two-handed hammer that smashes down on enemies in front of the Barbarian. Hammer of the Ancients deals a large amount of damage and has a higher chance to critically strike. The ability does take 20 Fury to use, but that's just over 3 bashes, so it doesn't take long to generate. You can also save up your Fury and unleash 4 to 5 blows to quickly beat down enemies. Level 3 brings in a new ability, Cleave, to the left mouse click slot, so you must decide if you want to continue using Bash or swap out for this new ability. Cleave generates less Fury and deals less damage than Bash. Cleave also hits multiple enemies in an arc in front of the Barbarian though, so for this reason, you'll want to use Cleave for groups of enemies and Bash for single target foes. You unlock a new slot at the number 1 key at level 4. The new ability to go in this slot is called Ground Stomp. As it sounds, the Barbarian stomps on the ground and stuns all enemies nearby for 4 seconds. This can be helpful to get out of a tight spot, or stop an enemy from either fleeing or using an ability. It also generates 15 Fury, which is helpful for secondary attacks. At level 5, the Barbarian unlocks the skill Rend, which causes the enemy to bleed and take damage spread out over 3 seconds. Rend shares the same slot as Hammer of the Ancients, the right click slot. I decided to continue using Hammer of the Ancients instead of Rend, as most enemies died too fast for the damage to matter. In certain cases, such as bosses or mini-bosses, Rend was much more helpful in dealing the extra bit of damage. Level 6 brings the Barbarian his first rune called Clobber, which is for Bash. Now Bash has a 35% chance to stun the target instead of knocking targets back. This can be much more useful than previously, however, Cleave still seems to be the better choice for hitting multiple enemies. I would recommend switching to Bash with Clobber on boss fights though, as bosses and mini-bosses are susceptible to stuns and other status effects. At level 7, the Barbarian unlocks a new rune for Hammer of the Ancients called Rolling Thunder that causes a shockwave to emit from the hammer, dealing damage in a straight line after striking. As I mentioned earlier, I preferred Hammer of the Ancients over Rend anyway in most circumstances, so really there isn't much choice, you just get a bonus to your ability. Level 8 brings a sweet new ability to the number 1 key called Leap, and is a whole new skill. Leap doesn't have a specific minimum or maximum range, but you are limited to the length of the screen. When landing from Leap, enemies nearby take damage and are slowed for 3 seconds. This ability hands down is much more useful than Ground Stomp, the ability it shares a slot with. While the stun can be nice, Leap will help you get out of tight situations better, will help you travel across the map faster, and does damage to enemies at the same time. Oddly enough, I use Leap to get around as much as I did to attack or escape enemies. When using Leap, you can go up or down levels, completely bypassing stairs. Just be careful leaving friends behind in multiplayer. The Barbarian gets 2 unlocks at level 9. The first is a rune for Cleave called Rupture. Rupture causes enemies to explode upon death when struck by Cleave. This means that it is even more effective in groups of enemies, much like the wizard's rune Explosive Bolts for Shock Pulse. While Cleave was nice in dealing with groups of enemies before, this rune improves it exponentially. The other unlock at level 9 is a whole new ability and a whole new slot. Now the Barbarian gets a slot open for the number 2 key and the ability Ancient Spear to go along with it. The Barbarian throws a spear at the target, generating 15 Fury, impales the enemy, then pulls them back towards him, all while dealing a good amount of damage to the target. This ability also slows the movement speed of the enemy for 3 seconds, helping to keep them near you. This can be frustrating when other enemies get in the way of the enemy you intended to attack, but overall is a very useful skill. Passive abilities are the only unlock the Barbarian receives at level 10, but you get to choose between 2 of them. Being passive of course means these abilities stay active all the time and do not require any fury to use. The 2 abilities are Pound of Flesh and Ruthless. Pound of Flesh makes it 25% more likely for health orbs to drop, and makes them heal twice as much. In case you didn't know, health orbs have replaced potion spamming in the game. As you fight enemies, health orbs drop and heal your character or party when you walk over them. Ruthless increases your chances of a critical strike by 5% and the damage of criticals by 50%. The ability also points out that many skills require critical strikes to trigger their effects, however in the beta I never found any ability that stated that. At level 11, the Barbarian unlocks the third and final primary ability for the left-click skill slot. This ability is called Frenzy and generates 3 Fury per attack, increases the attack speed of the Barbarian by 15% when striking an enemy, and can stack up to 5 times for a total of 75% increased attack speed. It does not increase movement speed this time around, but that does come later as a rune. Now it's a difficult choice between Frenzy and Bash for single target foes. Frenzy is awesome and can greatly increase your damage output, especially if wielding a two-handed weapon. My only major complaint with Frenzy is how quickly the buff runs out. This early in the game, enemies can be pretty spread out, and when moving from group to group, it's easy to lose your 5 stacks of Frenzy. By the time you get up to 5, all the enemies are dead, meaning you have to start over again. This is where the two-handed weapons are at a slight disadvantage. Getting back up to 5 stacks can be pretty slow. Using Leap to bridge that gap helps, but Leap has a 10-second cooldown. Usually I'd end up switching to Frenzy if it was a fight where I needed to generate Fury faster, using Bash if I wanted to stunlock an enemy, or using Cleave for multiple targets or AoE. Also at level 11, the rune for Rend is unlocked called Ravage. This rune increases the range on Rend to 17 yards. This can actually be really helpful now in clearing out groups of enemies with a single strike if you're trying to get XP bonuses. It's a little dangerous since you have to surround yourself with enemies to maximize Rend's damage output. It's still really helpful as a damage over time ability on bosses and single target foes. A new ability comes to the same right click slot at level 12 anyway, called Seismic Slam. This move is devastating to groups of enemies, but takes a whopping 30 fury to use. Seismic Slam smashes the ground, causing a shockwave to be sent out in front of the Barbarian. This skill seems strangely similar to Hammer of the Ancients with the Rolling Thunder rune, however Seismic Slam does more damage and is about 3 times the width. The ability also knocks back enemies, which can be useful if you want to use the ability multiple times. Also at level 12 is a new rune for Ground Stomp called Deafening Crash. The rune adds a 3-second slowing effect to enemies after they come out of the initial 4-second stun. This is probably best used as an escape option, and while handy, I'll take Leap every time if forced to choose. Finally, level 13 caps us out in the beta, and brings with it 3 unlocks. The first is a new skill called Revenge, which is set to the number 2 skill slot. This ability costs no rage, but it can only be used when randomly activated. Revenge has a 15% chance of being available whenever the Barbarian is struck by an enemy. When using Revenge, it hits all nearby enemies for a large amount of damage, and heals 5% of the Barbarian's total health for each enemy struck. This can be handy if you're low on health, but Barbarians are generally used to taking a beating, so it's not too often you're in trouble. I still felt like Ancient Spear was a better choice to generate Fury, as well as pull in that runaway enemy. Next you unlock another passive ability called Nerves of Steel. This ability increases the Barbarian's armor by the amount of his vitality. This might be more helpful later in the game, but for now I decided to stick with Ruthless. Your last unlock is another rune for Bash called Onslaught. Again, the knockback is removed, and now the ability adds 2 reverberations that deal an extra 22% weapon damage each. I feel Clobber is still a more helpful rune in stunning single target enemies, but that's the beauty of runes, you can switch them out as you please. And that's all I have for the Barbarian class. I really enjoyed playing the Barbarian, as it seems to fit my playstyle. It does seem a little more technical with more decisions than some of the other classes, such as two-hand weapons or dual wielding. Looking at the other runes and abilities available later in the game gets me pretty excited though. Make sure to keep an eye out for our future videos with the Monk, Demon Hunter, and Witch Doctor. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in Hell May 15th.